Okay, 6 o'clock and the room is packed. It must be map mayhem. So welcome everyone to this very special month packed with all sorts of talks about maps, specifically about the American West. So it's great to have you here. Also, we have everybody there in remote land. It's also packed. We have more than 30 people or so. So great to have you all here. So with this, let's get into Map Mayhem, which again is going to be almost every Tuesday. We're going to have great lectures, but let's start from the very beginning. Let's start from where it all started with the discovery and exploration of this land that we now call Colorado, and see how it was mapped and how these people came through here, from Spaniards to Mexicans to French to Americans. And what we're going to do is start with the very best. Let's start with somebody that is extremely passionate, that extremely enthusiastic, and the most avid map collector of Colorado, Wesley Brown, that is going to tell us about the mapping from 1540 to 1861, when this region became the Colorado Territory. So with that, Wes, come over here and introduce us to our beautiful state of Colorado. Yeah.
If it gets too dark, no romance going on out there now. But we wanted you to see the images, because if you've been to many map talks, you know you always sit in the first few rows when you go to a map presentation, because the images really matter. So to repeat, what we're going to work on is the history of the geographical image of Colorado as it comes onto the printed map. Now, the native people here, the Indians, they knew tons about the geography of this area. So this is not going to be an analysis of their knowledge, although their knowledge is going to inform the explorers. This is going to be a knowledge of the Europeans or the Americans or people looking at printed documents. That's what we're going to be focusing on. And we're going to begin in the early 1500s, and we're going to end with Colorado's territorial government, when the territory of Colorado begins in 1861. Now, through most of history,
there's
something going on. Oh, that thing up there. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
I love this image of Colorado. We have the Great Plains smashing up against all these mountain ranges, and the borders of Colorado. You know how the borders of Colorado were established back in 1859 to 1861, when the debates were going to try to establish the new territory. It's extraordinary how the congressmen and the senators understood at that time the exact proportions of a modern PowerPoint slide. And that's how we got our boundaries. Now, this is the image that you're very used to looking at, but through most of history, this is what Colorado looked like on the map. And you're going to see that as I go through this. Now, Colorado, actually, through most of history, was simply a place to be avoided by people other than its occupants, its permanent occupants here. And now telling the story of 300 plus years is going to require lots of simplification. So I apologize for that, but I think it will benefit you if I simplify things. And one of the things that we'll do is break the story down into 6 chapters. And this begins the first chapter, the mythical mapping of New Spain, the mythical mapping of New Spain. And we begin with the legend of the 7 cities. And let me read to you this text describing the legend, written in about shortly after the year 711. They say that at the time of 711, 7 bishops embarked from Spain and came with ships and people to this island, where they founded a city. And so this notion of the 7 great wealthy cities on an island was in the Atlantic, floating around in different islands. And with the European discovery and entry into the New World, when they came to the New World, they moved that legend to North America with them. After the horrific 8-year journey from Florida to Mexico, as one of 4 survivors out of 400 Spanish conquistadors, Cabeza de Vaca fabricated tales of these golden rich cities up to the north when he finally made it to Mexico. And so these yards are spun into this mad obsession by the Spanish in Mexico to find these great wealthy cities up in what would now be the southwestern United States. In 1539, the Franciscan priest named Marcos de Niza conducted a brief expedition, just a little bit into what would be about Arizona at the most. And on his return, he assured his superiors that the 7 cities were indeed up there, up to the north. And he had even seen one of them, well, from a distance. And it was Cibola. And this information will then show up on this extraordinary map. This is the first, by the way, all the maps that you see are from my collection, except for 2 manuscript maps that we'll see, Mexican manuscript maps. But this is a wonderful map. It's the first map of the Southwest. And it was made by the Venetian Giacomo Gastaldi. And with these symbols, if you look to the southwest, you see these steepled cities. You see the word Cibola slightly differently spelled. Those symbols relate to the 7 cities that are fabled to be up to the north somewhere. Cibola itself very quickly becomes a shorthand for all 7 cities. And at a later point, it becomes associated with the Zuni pueblos as well. Now, such tidings culminate in Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's enormous expedition in 1540, coming up and all around the Southwest looking for these golden cities. Now, I want you to imagine you're in an Indian village somewhere, and you have 400 Spaniards and 1,300 Mexican Indians all marching your village. The first thing they say is, give us all your food. And the second thing they say is, where are the wealthy, great cities of gold? And you can imagine what the elders of that village were thinking. They're going to take the best talking, fastest moving brave they've got and say, take these people as far away from here as you possibly can go. And so for 2 years, they're wandering all over the Southwest, trying to find these great golden cities. They end up in central Kansas. And finally, they give up and they come back, maybe touching the southeastern corner of Colorado on their way back. But 2 exhausting years yield nothing for them. Now, evidence of that comes up on this great map. And you notice there's 2 different years there. The one, if there are 2, the year to the left is the first edition of the map. And the number to the right would be my particular copy of that map. So in 1556, Coronado's expedition shows up on this great map by another Venetian, Giovanni Battista Ramuzio. And if we look at a close-up, now we see Cibola on the map. And we'll see the place named Quivira, which is mistakenly placed way over to the west on the map. But the term Quivira was introduced by Coronado by an Indian describing a land rich in gold and in the Great Plains to the northeast. Thus, Quivira became the primary goal of the expedition, and eventually they proved to be unremarkable Wichita and Pawnee villages in central Kansas, as we said before. And so and these other names that you see, along with the names that we saw from the earlier map, Anzas, or what am I trying to, the prior, Marcos de Nizas, the Niza names and the Coronado names, These names are going to be used again and again on maps for the next 100 years, but they're just rumors of places. These explorers have met with native people who've told them about some place. They've tried to figure out what the word is and how to translate it. And these are the names that we see on the maps. So if we go to another map, this is a beauty from 1572. And if you look at the interior, doesn't it look like there's great certain knowledge about mountain ranges and places and all? It's all fiction. There's none of this is really understood at this period. Now, a few years after this map was made, Antonio de Espejo went to the Rio Grande area looking for 3 lost friars. And in this course of that, they were on the Rio Grande, the upper Rio Grande, they heard about this great lake. And that lake ends up being attached to this image of what we would think of as the Rio Grande, but it's dumping into the Sea of California. And this lake, if we look at a close-up of the lake, it translates to the fatherland of the 7 cities. And you see the seven cities on this map. So we're going to have to end our first chapter here. We've covered roughly the 1500s. And what was the source of our information? It was Spanish information, mostly rumors conveyed by the native people. And the maps, who made the maps? Mostly Italians at this point, mostly Italian maps. So let's go on to our second chapter, mapping of the Rio Grande Valley. The first significant change in the map comes in the 1650s with the renowned map maker Nicolas Sanson d'Abbeville. And he was a great step forward. He was quite scientific in his approaches. And he had, his maps were so well regarded that he helped put France in the forefront. And really for the next century, from about 1650 on, the Dutch had been supplanted and the French take over as the dominant mapping source. And this is this beautiful map that he produces. And we're going to focus on the Southwest. And now we have this image of what we call the Rio Grande, what was called then the Rio del Norte. And we see this image on the map. Now, this is reflecting real information of what would be in the Albuquerque and up and down that area. We have actual Spanish settlements, Santa Fe, Taos, Socorro. We have Indian pueblos, Moki, which would be Hopi, Zuni, Acoma on the map. We've got tribal names, Navajo and Apache. So this is showing us real information. But you can see a few goofy things about this map as well. And to just get in your minds, I'm going to give you a real geography lesson, and you're going to be, the rivers of Colorado will be emblazoned in your mind by the time we finish today. So look at the Rio Grande and notice where it begins and where it ends. And is it anywhere near the Great Salt Lake? It is not. But that is not known at that time. So again, and where does it empty? In the Gulf of Mexico. So that is not understood at the time. So again, we have the headwaters of the Rio Grande is this theoretical lake up to the north. But this is still an amazing step forward for us in the history of mapping. But things really get good with the great Italian map maker, Vincenzo Maria Coronelli. And he is even a step forward. He is so good that even though he's working in Italy, the King of France demands that he comes to France and he works in Paris. And he's able to get all this information working for the king, because the French had a policy of when their information came back from the field, it was shared with the trade. In other words, it was allowed to be put on publicly printed maps. And so Coronelli is finding out this information. And one of the sources that he used was from a guy named Diego de Peñalosa to make this great map. I got to get this to. Let's try this. Oh, it moved. Okay, good. To make this great map. Now, Peñalosa was the governor of New Mexico from 1661 to 1664. He was a bad guy. I mean, when you read about him, he did all kinds of terrible things to the natives and to the Spaniards both. And he was brought down to Mexico. He was actually banished from New Spain and Spain. So what did he do? He went to the French and sold them all his secrets about New Mexico. And we see that on this wonderful map. And so now you can see an image of New Mexico that is really advanced. In fact, this image would be the image that lasts for the next 100 years or so. So the lake is gone. You see El Paso down at the bottom right here. El Paso, that's the first time it shows up on a map, and he's got the Rio Grande bending off to the Gulf and so forth. So this is a great advance forward, and yet so few of these maps were printed. It was so little understood that it didn't really have much impact until the next year. And Coronelli the next year came out with this blockbuster of a map. It was printed in an atlas that everybody loved. And so it was widely circulated. And of course, he's going to have the same image. So if you look up in this area of New Mexico, you see that same beautifully advanced image of the area just immediately south of us. So we're going to end our second chapter there. And let's just review. Where did the information come from for these maps? Who are the actors? The Spanish, exactly, the Spanish. And they came this time from their actually being in the places that were mapped, at least in terms of the Rio Grande Valley. And who are the map makers? The French. One Italian, yes, okay, very good. He was a Venetian, you're absolutely right. But most of these maps were printed in France and supported by the French. And he got his information when he was working up in France. So now let's go on to the third chapter, which is the understanding of the Mississippi Valley. You can see we're slowly creeping in to Colorado, but it's going to take many centuries for that to happen. So far, our stories revolved around the Spanish, but now the story is going to switch to the French. I must have been moving forward. Let's see. There we go. This is the slide I wanted. Thank you. In 1682, Sieur de la Salle leaves Canada. He and his men get to the Great Lakes, and they get out onto the Mississippi River, and they follow the Mississippi River all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And what does he do? He claims all the land drained by the Mississippi for his king, King Louis XIV. Now, the question is, if you've been meandering your way down twists and turns for 1,000 miles, do you know where you are on that coast? You don't. He had no idea. And unfortunately, La Salle really goofed up. He thought he was about 500 miles further to the west. So if we go back to Coronelli's map, who is going to be reflecting the information as thought at the time about the Mississippi, which they're now just beginning to know, we see that the Mississippi is coming out right next to the Rio Grande River. And that would be a real shocker to the Texans if they could claim control of Mississippi as well. So you see, this is a bit of a problem. So now I want to focus your attention on the rivers to the east. Get these in your mind. Think about the North and South Platte. See how the North Platte hooks down into northern Colorado, and the Kansas River and its two main tributaries that are in eastern Colorado, and of course the course of the Arkansas, because those are going to be the actors that we're now going to be wanting to watch how they develop on the map. Now, the French are doing all this exploration. The English are not players, at least at this moment in this part of the world. It's the French. But because they're getting their information out, I like this map of Herman Mall. And he's an Englishman, and he creates a confusing looking map, but I'm going to point out some of the high points here. So first of all, we've got Missourites. And so this is the tribe of Indians that are on the confluence of the Missouri with the Mississippi, and that's where we get the river's name. You notice the Kansas are up here, and we have an early image of the Kansas River, which you just got to see on the blue slide just before. And the Arkansas is shown now on the map. So these are great advances. And what about the upper Rio Grande Valley? What is this lake? Lake Conibas. Well, that is proof that in 1700, Coloradans were smoking pot. You have it right there on the map. So now let's see how this develops. It's going to, you got to realize I'm just skipping from one high point to the other, and I don't have the luxury to hit all the middle ground that I'd love to talk to you about. But the next map maker we're going to talk about is this guy, Guillaume Delisle, who is an extraordinary genius of a map maker. And he's, of course, French, and he is the map maker to the king. So he's privy to all this information. And this is the map that he produces in 1718. This is an extraordinary map, and we could spend a half hour talking about it, but I know you don't want to. So we're going to move on. And what we're going to do is look at some of the key points that this map reveals that are relative to us as Coloradans. And so we're going to see the Arkansas is up here, and this is the pretty accurate location of where it enters the Mississippi. Now he has all his rivers been way too far up to the north, but he still is giving us some really good information with that. Let me see my other notes here. Right here, you see Natchitoches. Now, this was the French fort built in 1717, the year before this was made. Now, think of the earlier maps we were looking at, where there would be place names and fabled information that was hundreds of years old. This is cutting edge stuff. The year before. Here we have Mission de los Tejos, established 1716. So this is the first usage of the word Texas on a map. And we see even Albuquerque shows up on his map for the first time. So it's such a great advance that really there aren't many advances after that. And this is a good example of a very fine French map maker, 45 years later. And the Western image looks about the same. Now, and where's Colorado on this map? It's unknown. It's merely a place to put a decorative cartouche. Colorado still hasn't found its way onto the map. Now, I want to end this chapter with this wonderful map. Antoine Soulard was the Surveyor General of the upper, in St. Louis, for the upper Louisiana area. And in 1794, he produces an excellent group of maps, which are copied by this man, Georges Henry Victor Collot. And he publishes this great map in 1796. And let's look at a few of the things that it has to tell us. I want you to look at the mountain range. It's pretty hard to miss on this map, isn't it? Well, what's going on here is now we've got this notion of one great central spiny, stony mountains. And here they are, and it looks way too far to the west, right? And because it is placed way too far to the west on this map. But what the map maker is doing is he's kind of combining the Sierra Nevadas and the Rockies and pushing it all together, one great mountain chain. This is an important image for you to put yourself into Thomas Jefferson's mind when he was planning the Lewis and Clark expedition, because what was expected to happen was that you'd follow up the Missouri or some river to the west, and you keep going in your canoe until the point where you couldn't go anymore. You'd go over one little mountain range, or maybe one big mountain range, And then you'd find a river to get on and you just skittle your way right on down to the Pacific. And that was the basic thought that a map like this would actually instill. And so that's a problem. Now look at how late we are, 1796. So we've really moved up in time. We do have something interesting that relates to Colorado. If we look at the conjectural Platte River, they weren't really there yet, but this is conjectural information. We see a text here that reads branch that has its source near Santa Fe. So the French and the Americans are dreaming of engaging in commerce with the Spanish from their most northern outlet, which would be Santa Fe. And that's what this is, hoping that there's some kind of waterway that will get us there. So at this point, we are going to leave this story about the French, our third chapter. You see what the state of lack of understanding is. We still don't have anything in Colorado. We're going to go to the fourth chapter, which is back to the Spaniards. And now we're going to look at expeditions into Colorado from Santa Fe, real expeditions. And I want to put this map up because I want you to think about why they wanted to do this expedition and why it made sense. So the Spanish, of course, had their Santa Fe and their northern New Mexico outposts right about here. And they also had some missions in California. And they thought, well, gee, wouldn't it be great if we could find a land route to Monterey? Now, we know that that would be a tremendously challenging thing, but they didn't know that at the time. They thought we'd go out west, we'd go over this mountain range, and we'd find this great river, which would take us right there. Now, what river would that be? Well, you have to remember the Rio Grande, the Mississippi. These are rivers, the Colorado, that go for 1,000 miles inland. Now, they knew at the time, having discovered the San Francisco Bay, that the Sacramento River had an enormous flow coming into that bay. And they presumed that there must be a river that just went inland 1,000 miles. So once you figure out where the headwaters are, you're going to catch that river and skedaddle your way right on out to the California mission. So that was the rationale. Now we know the problem with that, which this map beautifully illustrates, is called the Sierra Nevadas, which are in the way from that river and keeps that happening, but they didn't know that. So what they did was they launched the Dominguez. They launched the Dominguez Escalante mission exploration. Father Francisco Dominguez was an educated Mexican observer, really. Father Sylvester Escalante was a frontiersman with intimate Indian knowledge. And my hero, Don Bernardo de Miera y Pacheco, was the map maker. So they left Santa Fe July 29th, 1776. So think about that. The same year that our Declaration of Independence was passed, that's when they're trying to make this connection. So they leave it on, and this is, they essentially enter Colorado, south of Pagosa Springs, and they see mountain chain after mountain chain. In fact, they call these mountain ranges, and I quote, the backbone of North America. So they go through over the San Juan River, and the Animas would be right about there where Durango is, and the Dolores and the Gunnison and the Colorado. They get out in Utah, and then things start getting tough, and they go south trying to figure out their way. And then they get into Arizona, and then they run out of food, and they just said, we better get home. And they did remarkably make it back to Santa Fe, having walked 2,000 miles. 2,000 miles. And my hero, Miera Pacheco, made this map. In fact, he made 3 or 4 manuscript maps in 1777 and 1778. This is the first map that actually shows on it part of what would be Colorado. And now I've taken that northeastern corner of it to show you we have, this is sort of the track. And out of that information, meeting with people, learning from people, this is what they thought they learned. And there are actually lots of little camping sites along here that it shows. So this is this great map. How did it influence the world? It didn't, because the Spanish were very different. The Dutch, the English, the French, they thought cartographic information, let's get it out, good for commerce, good for business, makes us all rich. And they made that information available. The Spanish were the opposite. Our cartographic information could be used against us. These are state secrets, and they kept the map secret. So this map and copies of it were kept in Spain and in Mexico City, and no one got to see them. Now let's go on to Juan Bautista de Anza, who was the governor of New Mexico just 3 years later. Now he had a problem, and the problem was the Comanche kept coming in and destroying the Pueblo Indians' villages. And that was a problem for the Spanish. So they decided, we're going to have an attack against these Spanish. We're going to teach them who is boss. And so he led a force of 600 Spaniards and also Spanish military, and mostly Pueblo Indians, but some Utes and some Apaches came along to go after their rival if they could. And they came up into Colorado. They went up the San Luis Valley, up this way. They went over Plancha Pass, and then they got into this area in South Park and kind of went out to the Front Range, and they came down to about where Pueblo is, hunting for the Comanche, and they found the Comanche. And they had this tremendous battle where the renowned Comanche chief Cuerno Verde, Greenhorn Cuerno Verde, was killed along with many of his other chiefs. And it was a tremendous victory for the Spanish. And it actually led to a brief period of years of peace between the Comanche and the Pueblo Indians. That resulted in this map being produced, again, probably by Mier y Pacheco. And now we have some Colorado. Here's the Arkansas River shown. This would be where they had the battle shown right here. Anyhow, it's showing some information about Colorado. How did that get to be known to the world? Same problem. It was kept secret. The map information was just in Mexico City and in Spain. That changes, and it changes with this man. How many of you know about the great Baron Alexander von Humboldt? Many of you have read about him. He's an extraordinary character, well worth your time to read about. One of the great geniuses of the century, for sure, great Renaissance man. Charles Darwin, and I'm quoting Charles Darwin here, describes him as the world's greatest scientific traveler who ever lived. That's not a bad praise for him. Now, when he came to his great trip to the Americas, he had permission from the King of Spain to see all of the archives. And so in 1803, he spends almost a year in Mexico and around Mexico, making his own investigations to learn about New Spain. And in 1810, he publishes a wonderful book about New Spain with all kinds of tables of facts and statistics. And it includes this grand map, the map of New Spain by Alexander Humboldt in 1810. Now, this map is going to reveal for us all that information about Colorado from Anza and Escalante Dominguez. So before we do that, I just want to burn in your mind again these western rivers. So notice the San Juan. I failed to put in the Animas, but the Durango would be right about there. The Animas comes down, the hook of the Dolores, the Gunnison, the Colorado. And now let's look at Escalante's, at the Humboldt map. And here we see the San Juan, the Animas, the hook of the Dolores, and a conjectural Gunnison and Colorado River. So things are really coming into focus for the first time. So we're going to leave this fourth chapter. Who are the actors? The Spanish this time. And they got the information exploring in these two different explorations. Next, let's talk about the government expeditions that happened. I put this map up, and I want you to see the course of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804, 1806. My question is, were they ever close to Colorado? No. And so Lewis and Clark, we don't look to them for information about our state, our geographic history. Really important, but not for us. Now, I have a question for you. Remember this height of land theory, where all of the rivers come from one great source, one central high point. That was widely believed by all the explorers at the time. Well, let's look at the map as it really is. And we know, indeed, there is a height of land, but there are two of them. There was one in the Colorado Rockies, and there's another in this western Montana, western Wyoming, northwestern Wyoming area. And from these two great heights of land, most of the major rivers of the West do indeed come. But that is not understood at that point. Pike is thinking one great center. And so we'll see how that influences him. Now, this is an important map, and I've got the state boundaries to help you get these rivers in your mind. I want you to look at the Red River in particular, down, which would be the boundary between Oklahoma and Texas. Now, the New Mexico, at that point, it would be New Spain, was in a border controversy with the United States. And they weren't quite sure where the boundary of the Louisiana Purchase was. But it was probably going to involve the Red River. It was probably going to involve the Arkansas River. And knowing where the headwaters of those two streams were going to be huge in trying to sort out the complexities of who owned what land. And so just as Lewis and Clark were sent up north to try to understand more about the northern areas, Pike was needed to go to search for the southern boundaries. So his mission was to find the headwaters of the Arkansas and the Red Rivers. So now let's see what this wonderful young fellow has to do for us. Now, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike was in his 20s. He gets a very small company of 10 men. And they go out on July 1806. So interestingly, they left right before Lewis and Clark got back. So they didn't get the benefit of their later information. And they came up the Arkansas River, and they got to its junction with the Fountain River. Now, where's the Fountain? The Fountain is the river that goes down from Colorado Springs to Pueblo, and it's why Pueblo is right there. So they got to this spot, and they decided, well, let's climb the highest peak. Now, what would be the highest peak that they wanted to climb? It's Pikes Peak, right? Now, I want you to imagine leaving Pueblo to go climb the highest peak, what that would be like. They thought it would, they estimated they'd be back the next afternoon. In fact, they greatly regretted that because they so underestimated the distance, they didn't bother taking their blankets with them. So now, after 3 days on November 27th, 1806, and I'm reading a quote from Pike's journal, we arose hungry, thirsty, and extremely sore from the inequality of the rocks which we had lain on all night. So then they found themselves wading through waist-deep snow. And this is how he describes the clothing of his men. Our men were dressed in, quote, cotton summer overalls, moccasins, and no stockings. So us gallant mountaineers blasting our way up these peaks, imagine what these guys were trying to do in the snow. They gave it up and they went back home. And so ends the first recorded attempt to climb one of Colorado's 14ers. Now, when they got back to Pueblo, they went out and they went up into South Park, and they probably touched a little headwaters of the South Platte and thought it was the South Platte. They speculated accurately that it was. They came over Trout Creek to what would be Buena Vista. Now, at this point, they find this new river to the west. What are they thinking? This is the Red. The Red is supposed to come up and wrap around the Arkansas. This has clearly got to be the Red River. Hooray! They go down the Arkansas. Well, they go down what they think is the Red River, and they get back near Pueblo, and what do they find? Their own campsite. So they realize, oh no, we were on the headwaters of the Arkansas. So at least they figured the Arkansas out. So they go on down. Now they're deep into the winter in their summer clothing. They over the snow of the Sangre de Cristos, and they come to the next big river. And now they think, okay, now we've got to have found the Red River because it wraps around the Arkansas. But sure enough, the Spanish come up, arrest them, and say, you're trespassing, you're in New Spain, and you're on the Rio Grande River. So they are taken down to prison in Chihuahua. They're released through diplomatic negotiations the next year. They go back to Washington, and they produce their report in this wonderful map in the same year that we saw Humboldt's information came out. Now, I think of this map as the cartographic birth certificate for Colorado. Pike's great map. And we're going to look at a close-up of it. We see they came up the Arkansas River. Here's the Fountain River coming down from Colorado Springs. So they camped right there. What do you think that highest peak is? Pike's Peak, right? That would be Pike's Peak. Here's their conjectural Platte River. And we have the Arkansas, the headwaters, Buena Vista would be right there. The Rio Grande, this is where they got captured. This is interesting. This says the Yellowstone headwaters of the Missouri. Now, why is that there? Because Pike is trying to put all these rivers together in one little narrow spot. In fact, and I quote, he states, I have no hesitation in asserting that I can take a position in the mountains from whence I can visit the source of any of those two rivers in one day. Not two rivers, those rivers, meaning the Missouri, the headwaters of the Missouri, the Platte, the Arkansas, the Rio Grande, and the Colorado, all from one day. So he's buying into this thing. Now, the problem is he does something really good for map enthusiasts, and he does something that's not so good. What he does that's good is he clearly figures out the longitudinal location of the Front Range. So remember, there was confusion about how far west or east it is. He figures that out, and he dials that in. And now we have the Front Range of Colorado in the right spot. But in order to have all these rivers of the West coming together, he takes the Colorado features and he shifts them way up 200 miles too far to the north, way up into Wyoming. And so let's see what that is going to do in our future maps. This is a wonderful map, 1816, but we're looking at the 1820 version of it. And what I like about the 1820 version is it shows the results of the Adams-Onis Treaty between then New Spain and the United States in 1819. So just the year before. Now, the year after this, of course, there'd be the Mexican Revolution, and now we're talking Mexico, not New Spain. Now, this green line is the Arkansas River. There's Pikes Mountain, highest point, highest peak. Notice how we go way up into, this would be Jackson Lake, roughly, way up into Wyoming. So the treaty says you go to the headwaters of the Arkansas, and then you follow west on the 42nd parallel. Now you're all wondering, great, where's the 42nd parallel? Think of the line at the top of California, Nevada, Utah, that line, that's a 42nd parallel. And whereas it is relation to us, it's well into Wyoming. So what Pike has done is by pushing all this stuff up, he's got this straight line. Now you're going to notice how this changes with the next expedition. And it's going to change with this guy, Major Stephen Harriman Long. So Long was teaching mathematics at West Point at the time that he got this assignment. And he got to lead a scientific expedition. So he had artists, botanists, astronomers, geologists with him in his company of 20. This group left Nebraska in June of 1820, and they came out to what we would think of as Colorado. Picture yourself going down Interstate 76 from the northeastern corner of Colorado, and they're following the Platte River, the South Platte River, and finally they see the mountains. And as he states in his journal, our men were cheered by the distant view of the Rocky Mountains. And very soon they saw a great peak. What peak would that be? Long's Peak, of course. They see Long's Peak, but it doesn't have that name yet. They come down the Front Range. They're checking everything out. Right in Denver, they're going right through this area where Denver and all of its suburbs are, and they go over the Palmer Divide, and they see the great peak that Pike had attempted to climb 14 years before. Now, Dr. Edwin James and 2 other men in the Long expedition successfully climbed this peak. And they continue down, and now let's follow their track. They work their way down the Front Range. Again, they get to this Pueblo area. They go up a little bit to about where Canyon City is, but they think, no, we got to get back. And so they head on out the Arkansas. When they get to about La Junta, they decide to split their party. Captain Bell, the number 2 in command, takes one group, and they go down the Arkansas and survey it. But Long, he's going to find that Red River that has mystified everybody. And so he goes south into northern New Mexico, and they find a big river. And they start to follow that river east. And now we finally got the Red River. But what do they end up getting? They get the Canadian River. Now, those of you, that's a big river that drains northeastern New Mexico, but it eventually comes back into the Arkansas. So it's not the red. They still haven't found the Red River. It's got to be somewhere south of there. So now let's take a quick look at Long's map. I know you can't see that, but you can see this, hopefully. So we're looking at the close-up of Colorado. Here they are working their way down the South Platte. What is this highest peak? What's that going to become? Long's Peak. Right. And what is this James Peak? That's going to be Pike's Peak. He named it in honor of James, his botanist, who he highly regarded. But of course, it would quickly get changed. In fact, there are earlier maps in this that call it Pike's Peak. Notice this at the bottom of the map, Spanish Peaks. So he's done something very interesting on this map. If you think about it, when you're on Interstate 25 and you enter from Wyoming into Colorado, and you go and you finally leave down Raton Pass, almost the entire way, there's one of these 3 mastiffs that you can see. The whole time you either see Longs, Pikes, or Spanish Peaks, and he's got them right here on the map. So it's really a terrific advance for us. Now, the other thing that he does, because he has proper astronomical observations, he solves Pike's error. So he realizes that the latitude of all these Colorado features is down in this area. So he moves everything out of Wyoming and shoves it on down into Colorado. And to show you how accurate that is, you see this 4 right there. That was July 4th, where they spent the night. They spent the night reading the journal. It sounds like they were right at Denver. Now, Denver is just a little bit below the 40th parallel. And here's the 40th parallel. They've done a pretty good job for back at that time. So now let's see how this correction changes the map. Here we're looking at this beautiful Henry Tanner map. And if we look at a close-up, now we see the Arkansas River It goes to its headwaters at about Buena Vista, or Leadville, really, at about Leadville. And then you go due north. Now this is this great big section of several degrees of latitude. And then you go west out to California. Now this is going to be, for those of you that are familiar with the absurd claim of the Texans that at one point they had Colorado as part of their panhandle, this will be the eastern boundary of that panhandle that we're getting to see. The next step in our dialogue is going to involve the Lieutenant John Charles Fremont. He was later a major general, but at the time he leaves, he's lieutenant. He was a member of the Army Corps of Tropical Engineers. And he comes out on these, there's so much we could say about Fremont, but we don't have time. You won't give me the time. And so we're just going to hit a few things. First of all, he's got the best talent. He's got Kit Carson as a guide. He's got the great German map maker Charles Preuss. And he comes into Colorado on 3 different expeditions. His first expedition in 1842, he comes into Colorado. Then his great expedition all the way to the west and everything in 1843, he goes through Colorado. And then coming back, he goes through Colorado. So he's gained a lot of information. And notice what part of the state it is. It's the northern part, which is the area that we don't really know much about. And so he comes back, he publishes this fantastic map in 1845. And I know you can see all the details of it from where you're seated. But let's look at the part that's relative to Colorado. And he solves all kinds of riddles that were unknown. For example, nobody knew where this North Platte went. Well, he figured out that the North Platte goes up into Wyoming and then swings down into North Park, our Jackson County, where Walden is. He's got that shown as New Park. He's got Middle Park shown. This would be the Blue River and the Colorado leaving. And then South Park is shown on the map. He's even got Cherry Creek on the map. So this is a tremendous increase in the knowledge of the area. The last expedition I want to talk about involves Captain John Gunnison. Now, the big issue, of course, was the Civil War, the slavery issue. But ignoring the slavery issue, a big issue for the West was where would the Transcontinental Railroad go? And there were 4 or 5 major routes. You can imagine the huge economic advantage to whichever city would be the one that route. So everybody wanted to know where the route would be, to the north or the south. And one of the proposed routes, called the Central Route, would follow the 38th parallel right through what we know of as Colorado today. And it was John Gunnison and Lieutenant Beckwith's job to survey that. So they came up in 1853. They came up the Arkansas. They went over the Sangre de Cristos into the San Luis Valley. They went over Cochetopa Pass, and they came along to a river with signs saying Gunnison River all over it. No, I'm exaggerating. They came to a river and they followed it that would soon be for Gunnison just a few years later. They went out into Utah, and unfortunately, they had a run-in with, we think the best scholarship suggests Paiute Indians, and Gunnison and 8 of his men were killed. Now, Lieutenant Beckwith retrieved the papers, got back to Washington, and they produced this map in a real hurry. And I know you can't see the details, but I'll just tell you, we are now seeing the Central Rockies of Colorado. Here's the Gunnison. Elk Mountain shows up for the first time. And so the central area is now being mapped. So let's put all these expeditions together and see what we've got. You've got this wonderful spaghetti bowl of expeditions. Now, the problem was making a map of all this information. And that would go to Lieutenant G.K. Warren. And Warren graduated #1 in his West Point class. He was really a terrific map maker and an explorer. He would be out in the field during the summer season and back in Washington. And he was charged to make the great map of the West. And he did. After 3 years of work, he made this wonderful map. You can see all the details on it right before you. we are going to just look at Colorado. And this is the section of the map that would be Colorado today. Now, in your mind, I want you to think about these places. Start in Boston, Massachusetts, and go down all the way to Baltimore, Maryland, go all the way out to Cleveland, Ohio, and then north to Toronto, Canada. That rectangle is the same as the rectangle we have here. So think about how late this is, 1857. Now in 1857, that area I described would have thousands of villages, creeks, roads, towns, all kinds of things like that. Not the situation here. This was very much occupied by the native population at this time. There were a few little settlements in the San Luis Valley from Mexican citizens, and there were a few no longer Mexican citizens, but they came up during the Mexican era, and a few little bitty settlements in the Arkansas Valley. But basically, this area is very, very little known. Very little known. So now that brings up the question, why so little known? Why is Colorado so late? Why is Colorado so late? You know, Wyoming was the east-west transfer, that all the east-west traffic from the Americas to the West Coast, almost all of it happened through Wyoming. So our little state with less than 500,000 people up there today, they were the big shots back then. Colorado was nothing as in terms of the knowledge and the activity relating to the Americans back east at that time. What about New Mexico? New Mexico had been on the map for hundreds of years. It had been inhabited, of course, for thousands of years, but it had been well understood for hundreds of years. What about Colorado? Why was it so late? Well, first, obviously, the mountains, right? The mountains were an amazing impediment to east-west travel. The land belonged to the native people, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Utes. The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie made that very clear. The Indians in this state were nomadic people, and that has a very significant impact because they were unconquerable based upon the weaponry and the population at the time. So the Ute Indians would raid every single, whether it was Pueblo, whatever was set up, they would raid these. And so it was very hard for Americanized type habitations to get going in Colorado. So now let's talk a little bit about the role of the Indians in this whole process. Now, first of all, the Indians had intimate knowledge of their own geography because they were nomadic people in this area. And they even had knowledge of distant places in the Americas, we know, because of trading relations and so forth. They related this knowledge to the explorers. So the explorers would meet with Indians everywhere they went to find this information out. And the Indians served every one of these expeditions I've talked about, had Indian guides with them. They were critical providers of food and so forth when these expeditions came to them. They would try to trade goods, knives, pots, things like that in exchange for food, which they really needed. So now let's leave this stage and let's go to the final explosion of Colorado, which happens with the gold rush. Now, for decades, there had been rumors of gold in the Front Range area. And that was no big deal, but nobody had ever really pursued it. Green Russell was a professional gold miner in Georgia. Georgia enjoyed a significant gold economy, and he and 13 Cherokee miners, his brothers and 10 Cherokee miners, came out to the Front Range in 1858 to look for gold. And on their way, they were talking about what they're doing, and others kept joining them. And so by the time they got to the Front Range, right where we are, just a little bit south, a few miles south of where we are, there were 104 of them. Well, they didn't find much, and they didn't find anything, and the food was bad. And people started going back and going back and going back. They finally got down to the 13 Georgians, And what happened? But they found a little bit of gold right in this area. Now they're mining for gold, placer mining with pans in these creeks around here. They're not getting that much gold at that point. A man named John Cantrell, who was a trader coming down from Fort Laramie, right down Interstate 25, and he's coming down the Front Range to get to New Mexico, and he happens on these miners. And there's no one here at the point. All the native population that winters here, they're all out on the prairie where the protein is. And so he sees these guys. He trades food, which they need for bags of gold. He goes back to Kansas and Missouri. And August 26, 1858, the Kansas City Journal of Commerce announces the discovery of gold in western Kansas. So we are standing in what was then western Kansas territory. Small numbers start coming out to this Front Range area where Denver is in the fall of 1858. And right at the confluence of Cherry Creek is the important place. As a matter of fact, people would be queuing up, getting ready for the grass to get green. And in 1859, there was an explosion of people coming out to our area. 100,000 people are believed to have come out. Now, most of them got disgusted and went right back, but thousands still remain. And that's the gold rush. So what do they call the gold rush? Do they call it the Denver Gold Rush? They call it the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. Why Pikes Peak? It was 70 miles north of Pikes Peak. Why Pikes Peak? Because Colorado was so unknown at that time. That was the only landmark anybody had ever even heard of, was Pikes Peak. So this tremendous number of people come out. And if we look at the maps of the period, we actually see Denver City and Auraria right there, right on the map. The problem was all these little creeks around the Front Range, Ralston Creek, Golden, Boulder, this area in the Front Range, there's not very much gold there. And so by April, the whole thing of 1859, the whole thing was thought to be a humbug. But then on May 6th of 1859, John Gregory had the find of his life, and we had the Gregory Gulch 25 miles up into the mountains. And then strike after strike after strike happened in Gilpin County, in Clear Creek County. And that had enormous economic power. And that's what got Denver going. So you can imagine the devastation to the land that thousands of people would bring, coming in, cutting down every single tree they possibly could. So now, you think the land had it bad. What about the Indians? Let's just say a word about what happened to them. Now, the problem for the Indians, our Cheyenne and our Arapaho, this was their wintering place. Now, why did they need to winter here? There are no streams that flow in the eastern prairies of Colorado in the winter. In the absence of reservoirs, everything is dry but the South Platte and the Arkansas River, and that's it. So they needed flowing water. Well, we all know living here that every little creek all winter long flows out of the Front Range, and it all empties into either the South Platte or the Arkansas River. And so they had to winter in this area. It was vital to them. They had to have these creek bottoms with willows for winter feed, with cottonwoods for fuel. That was all essential. So just think what a disaster this was. 1858, everything's cool. 1859, 100,000 people are out here. Every valley, most have gone back, but still thousands of people are here with guns. They're in the valleys doing placer mining, the exact spots that the Indians need to winter. So this was a catastrophe for the native population of the eastern part of Colorado. That's a whole nother lecture, but we got to wrap this up. So in 1859, there was this energy to try to make a new state, a new territory. The problem was government for these miners was way back in eastern Kansas, 450 miles away. Well, how could they really have, thing about miners is they are very law and oriented people because they want to have claims that are adhered to. And so they want law and order. And they sent back delegations to Washington to try to get a new territory created. And it wasn't until 1861 that that territory is created. Now, Susan Scholten, Professor Susan Scholten up front, is an incredible expert in what I'm going to say in a few sentences. And if she could give us a lecture, it would be fantastic. But I'm going to simplify by basically saying that the Civil War was what kept this from happening. If Colorado became a territory, it would probably be a free territory. That would tip the scales. And so we weren't going to get a Colorado approved or any of the other names proposed until 1861 when the Civil War happened. And what happened then? The Southern delegations left. No problem. We can create Colorado, Dakota, and Nevada territories immediately once they're gone. So on February 28th, Colorado is created. Let's just look at the boundaries of where it came from, because I want you to have that in your mind. These are the dimensions of Colorado. Colorado was carved out of Nebraska, Kansas, a Nebraska territory. That's the 40th parallel right there. You know, this was surveyed as the baseline for the first survey. And do you know where Baseline Road is? If you ever want to know where the 40th parallel is, just think of the latitude of Baseline Road or State Highway 70 or 7. That's the 40th parallel. So Denver is just down below. We were in Kansas territory. New Mexico had the famous knots that came up into Colorado. And then everything west of the Continental Divide was Utah. So President Lincoln wasted no time and appointed Francis Case, who came right out and produced the first territorial map of Colorado in 1861. And I'll end my talk there. Thank you very much for your attention tonight. Now it's my chance to, before any questions, if you won't throw me off, I want to give an advertisement for our next 3 lectures, because they're going to be even better. They all are Tuesday night. They're at 6 o'clock in this space. And I want you to notice the gap. There's a 2 gap between the 3rd and the 4th program. So the first program is going to be by Chris Lane. Where is Chris? Here's Chris Lane. You will love hearing his right in the 3rd. Raise your hand again, Chris. Some of the folks. Chris is an amazing speaker, and he's going to go into much more detail, unveiling the continent spine, the discovery of the mapping of the Rocky Mountains. So he's going to have the luxury of this whole lecture to focus on this area that I just touched on tonight. So now you guys are jazzed up for that story, and you're going to be the perfect audience for him. Now then, this is a image of Texas going all the way to the 42nd parallel. And here's the headwaters of the Arkansas. And the Texans like to claim this. I'm showing this because it's 1847, just at the end of this image. Now the Texans take advantage of that. And I love this map here, the Great Snows of Texas since 1836. They're claiming Steamboat, Vale, Aspen, etc. On this flimsy information of theirs from years in the past. And, you know, they do have this, even when they're cut down to size in 1850, they still have this exaggerated sense of importance. Now, this lecture that you really want to hear is by Dr. Stephen Hoffenberg. Steve, raise your hand. He's in the back corner there. You will love to hear a lecture by this guy. He's incredibly interesting. And he is going to be taking advantage of the wonderful Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that is here in this building that you can see for another couple of weeks, I believe. Is that right? You can see these are pictures of the treaty here in Colorado, just downstairs. And he's going to talk about the 1840s and this incredible period of the Mexican-American War and how all these territories are shuffled around. And hopefully you're primed and ready for that as well. Our final lecture will be by Tom Overton, and Tom is here somewhere. There he is, right? Come on, raise your hand, Tom. He's sitting next to Dr. Shelton. Tom is an expert on the early maps of Denver, and he's going to be talking to you about that. Oh, and I forgot to mention, next week, we're going to get a special treat because Craig Haggett, Craig, raise your hand, and Dennis McCarthy is in here. They've been working on this special project at the Denver Public Library where you can take any of the maps, modern maps, and then fold them right on top of the old maps and study how you could look at an image of what it looked like in 1873 and then see what it looks like in 1994 and so forth. They're going to teach you real quickly how to use that next week as well at the end of Chris's lecture. So with that, we've gone so long, probably best to, should we do a question or two or should we just wrap it up? Okay, any questions? Who discovered the river? Yeah, who did, I knew I did. It's funny. I was bike riding today, and I was thinking to myself, now the very first question is going to be one I don't know the answer to. What is that thing that I need to be studying? There were a whole bunch of expeditions and surveys going up the Red River, and Susan Schulten can probably tell you who it was. Do you know who it was? I don't know who it was. I've read about it. I can't remember who it was. Okay, who else wants to embarrass me with another question? Yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah, big time. Yeah. Well, he had 5 expeditions in all, and he definitely went into Utah. And what's so remarkable about him, there had been this belief that was shattered 10 years before, but still many people believe that all these rivers of the West, of the interior West, flowed out to California. And he was the one who definitively determined that there's something called the Great Basin. And you all know the Great Basin is the interior part of the West, Nevada and Utah, where the rivers drain in. They don't drain out to the ocean, they drain in. And that's the Great Basin. He figured that out. And that's on that 1845 map of mine. Thanks for asking the question that I knew. Any others? Okay, seeing none, I'll hang around should there be any others. Thanks you very much for coming.